If you're British and you got into photography in the 1970s, there's a pretty strong chance that your first introduction to 35mm SLR photography came from a communist country, either Russia or Eastern Germany. And most people of my generation who are into photography are either in the East Germany camp or the Russian camp. I was in the Russian camp because my first camera was a Zenit EM, which was built in what was then the Soviet Union. The Zenit EM came out in 1972 and lasted until the early 1980s, and they sold these by the absolute bucket load. It succeeded the Zenit E, which was very similar, except that the Zenit EM added automatic stop-down aperture, but in most respects was similar. And it's a bit of a beast. Zenith cameras came with the 58mm Helios lens, which, to be frank, wasn't a great lens. But now it's become quite popular with people who want to get the retro film look, because of course it has this kind of slightly dreamy, slightly soft look, which is popular with both photographers and filmmakers these days, so it's actually quite sought after. At the time though, I remember envying the people who had their lovely Olympus and Nikon lenses and thinking how much better they were. Now, in comparison with the shiny electronic Japanese cameras with their super bright viewfinders and slick interface and really nice design, the Zenith was a very crude mechanical monster, very heavy, very clunky, and it kind of looks like something you'd expect the local blacksmith to be able to churn out for you in terms of like cameras, in terms of its sophistication. On the plus side, it was very cheap, and because it was purely mechanical, there was not a lot to go wrong. Although of course they did go wrong, they were not that reliable. I remember that the one I had a strange kind of, the oil, the lubricant had a strange kind of smell about it, a very distinctive smell. I felt if I was blind or blindfolded, I could identify and recognize when that camera was in my vicinity just by the smell of it. The camera is entirely clockwork, there's no battery. Even the light meter is not, there's a selenium cell light meter, no battery required. So it was very, very simple in operation. On the top, it had a simple shutter speed dial, which only had shutter speeds going from a 30th of a second up to 500th, with 30 being the flash sync speed. And to change them, you had to pull and turn and then drop it back down into the right slot. You had obviously a manual winding crank with the film counter on the top. And on the left-hand side of the prism, you had your light meter and your rewind crank. Inside, it's pretty standard for a 35mm SLR camera. Now, to use the camera, the first thing you had to do was take a light reading, and the light meter is here on the top in front of the prism. It's a selenium cell meter, so as I said, it doesn't require a battery. Now, when I was using this camera, all my pictures seemed to be underexposed by a good couple of stops. And I don't know whether that's because it was the camera, the meter wasn't very accurate, or because, which is probably more likely, I didn't really know what I was doing. I was young, I was a teenager, and this was my first camera, my first ever camera. But to use it, you would effectively point your meter at your subject. A needle would move inside this window here, and then you would turn this little dial here until a little metal ring was lined up over the needle. Once you've done that, that would then give you your exposure reading. So this is telling me 1/60th f11. So I would set a 60th of a second on here, and I would set f11 on the lens of Bob your uncle. Now, a few things to say about this camera. The viewfinder was quite dim, even by the standards of the day, and I found you had to focus back and forth a few times till you were sure that what you had was in focus. There's just a microprism ring, there's no split image on this camera. Once you've done that, you're ready to take a picture. The shutter button was on the top. It's a very small shutter button, and it required quite a lot of pressure to actually take a picture. So it would leave a little indentation in your finger. It's a small one, it only lasted for a few seconds. And you can hear by the sound of it that it has this kind of very clockworky kind of sound. Once you've taken all of your 36 or 24 pictures, you have to rewind the film. And to do that, there's a little ring around the shutter button which you would turn anti-clockwise. It's very stiff on this camera, but it was even stiff at the time on my camera. And you would turn it that way. That would disengage the cogs, and then you would pop this rewind crank up, and then you would start the task of rewinding. And because it didn't have a kind of like a handle or anything on it, you just had to twizzle this thing, it took quite a long time to rewind the film, and it was quite stiff sometimes. The other thing that I found with my camera is that when you set it to the rewind position on the around the shutter button, it didn't always disengage the the cogs. So the amount of times I ripped all my sprocket holes trying to get the film out of the camera was probably like 1 in 5 films. It was very unreliable. But apart from the fact that my pictures were underexposed and often I ripped all the sprocket holes, I did manage to take a few nice pictures with this camera. Obviously, compared to the sort of Japanese cameras of the time, it was big and heavy. Now, I bought my Zenit EM in around about 1978, 1979 as a 15-year-old boy. I was gutted to find that shortly after I bought mine, they released a Moscow Olympics version which had Olympic rings on it, but there you go. But I didn't really use it for very long because about 6 months after I got this camera, I got a job with the local pro photographer in his studio assisting him. And he had a lot of kit which he let me use whenever I wanted to. One of which was this Canon F1, which is a top of the range professional flagship camera. So within 6 months of getting this Zenit, I had unlimited access to this. And obviously, given the choice, the Zenit didn't get used very much. I'm going to be talking about the Canon F1 in my next video, so do stay tuned to find out all about this classic.